In this video, we will take a closer look at recent humanitarian migrants in Sweden and the question of crime. Do immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq commit more crime than ethnic Swedes? To answer our question, we'll look at news stories from the BBC, The Economist. We'll also review crime data from a recent Swedish crime survey, and then we'll apply some basic common sense. The evidence will show that migrants are committing more crimes than their native hosts, and they are committing so many more crimes that crime statistics across Sweden are rising as a result. Crime among second-generation immigrants may also be even worse than the native population of Sweden. Why, an Economist headline asks, are young men in Sweden shooting each other? The story in The Economist offers an arresting statistic. In 2011, only 17 people were killed by firearms. In 2017, the country had over 300 shootings, leaving 41 dead and more than 100 injured. The story in The Economist describes shootings and attacks with hand grenades. The source of this violence, they say, is a new kind of gang. Where earlier gangs were bikers or organized crime groups from the Balkans, the new gangs are mostly young men and they are mostly disorganized. Instead of being involved in organized crimes, they're involved in petty crime and violence. Lots of violence. Other publications, like the New York Times or the Spectator, agree with The Economist. Gang violence and grenade attacks are on the rise in Sweden. A story in the Spectator tells of an instance where 50 cars were torched in a garage in Uppsala. Citizens nearby repeatedly called the emergency services, but the fire department didn't show up for over 3 hours, and when the fire department did show up, they were accompanied by police with riot gear and machine guns. In other words, the Spectator story is associating the gang violence and the rise in violence in Sweden with what some people call no-go zones, or what's referred to by Swedish police as vulnerable areas. These are places where emergency services might fear to go without a police escort, and according to some recent reports, they've been spreading throughout Sweden. Here's independent journalist Tim Pool putting a pertinent question to the mayor of Sodertalje.
I guess the big question that everyone wants to know, has there been an increase in crime related to bringing in refugees or migrants?
Well, no, we don't think like that. That's awful, really, to try to count things like that out.
Swedish politicians may not want to consider whether migrants bring more crime, but I think it's an important issue. Sweden has brought in hundreds of thousands of migrants from places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The bulk of these immigrants arrived in the latter half of 2015. Sweden has an annual crime survey that asks more than 10,000 respondents whether or not they were victims of different types of crime. The English results of the 2017 survey were recently published. The 2017 survey asks people about their experience in the year 2016, and the results are not good. In fact, we can see in this nice graph that every broad category of crime has an upward trend, and they all start moving up around 2015. However, this graph is showing movement in trends on an objective scale and not a relative scale. That makes a movement between 1 and 2% of people reporting that they are the victim of some type of crime seem like a small increase, but in reality, that increase from 1 to 2% represents a doubling of that type of crime. This table shows the percentage increase of each type of crime between 2015 and 2016. What we see is 35% more assault, 40% more victims of sex offenses, 55% more victims of robbery. In general, crime is up in all categories except car theft. Car theft is flat, so that's nice. What's important to remember about this data is that it's a binary choice. Yes, I was the victim of a crime, or no, I wasn't. That means that people who are victims multiple times are represented as a single yes. Imagine that migrants or gangs are the reason behind this increase in crime, And imagine that these migrants and gangs are concentrated in specific areas. That makes it possible that a relatively small group of Swedes is heavily impacted, disproportionately impacted. Possibly this small group of Swedes is repeatedly victimized, and the crime statistics, even though they show an increase in crime, sometimes a large increase in crime, across every category of crime, except for car theft, the crime statistics wouldn't capture the trend of a small group of Swedes being repeatedly victimized. The argument I'm trying to present is that large numbers of immigrants arrive, and in the following year, crime starts to trend up in all categories except car theft. I'm suggesting that there is potentially a connection between the two things. This is something that many Swedish politicians and Swedish people find objectionable. Here's an excerpt from a documentary on Sweden by Ari Horowitz, asking Swedes if they think migrants are responsible for an increase in sexual assaults.
Do you think the sexual assault problem is an Islamic problem or not really?
No. I think it's a general problem among men.
Yeah, the problem isn't like this culture or that culture. The problem is male culture.
I don't think the immigrants is the problem.
No, it's not. Like, that's just like a tiny bit of the problem. And like, when that happens, like it's because we didn't like bring them in the right way.
And I don't see that connection at all. And I would very much like to see the evidence of such a connection.
Do you think it's almost racist to make that connection?
Yes, I think so.
Is there a point where you think that Sweden's done too much to bring people in, or do you think there's...
No, there is no too much in helping people.
And is there a limit, do you think, to how many immigrants Sweden can take?
No.
The same Economist article that I referenced earlier has a slightly different take on the situation. The Economist author claims that while the gang members who are driving the recent crime wave are immigrants, they are not recent arrivals, but rather these are immigrants from countries like Iraq, Somalia, or Yugoslavia who have been in Sweden for years, or that the gang members are the children of those immigrants, so-called second-generation immigrants. The Economist's interpretation is even worse than what I've suggested, because immigrants from countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria are a growing percentage of Sweden's population. The children of these immigrants, so-called second-generation immigrants, will be an even larger share of the population. If second-generation immigrants are a problem in terms of crime, then that's a bad sign for Sweden's long-term future. An article in The Telegraph reads, quote, "A suspected terrorist targeted young children as he drove a hijacked lorry into a crowded shopping street in Stockholm. Infants' buggies were sent flying through the air as the vehicle zigzagged," end quote, along the sidewalk. The terrorist who was driving that hijacked lorry was named Rakhmet Akilov, and Rakhmet was taken alive and held in custody. Recently, a Swedish court judged him to be mentally healthy enough to stand trial. Here's a quote that's been through Google Translate from a Swedish news source about Rakhmet Akilov as he prepares for the trial. Quote, "Akilov also said that he was good at getting ready for cooking and playing table tennis with the staff at the scene since the trial. Although he said earlier he expected to die in the assault, Akilov expresses himself that he is happy that he is alive today. Akilov believes that his deeds are not so good, but not too bad." Imagine that. A foreign terrorist comes to your country to murder your children, and you put that murderer in the vaunted Swedish prison system renowned for its ability to rehabilitate prisoners. You let him play ping pong and cook nice meals, and as a result, you've managed to reform the man so much that before his pending trial, he'll acknowledge that what he did was maybe not so good, but still not so bad. I bring this up to suggest that the Swedes are not responding appropriately to the magnitude of the criminal incursion that they are facing. Before I close, I want to say a word about potential counter-arguments. The most compelling counter-argument is simply the observation that Sweden is still a safe country to live in compared to places like the United States. Although Sweden's crime rates are rising, If you look at a timeline of many decades, Sweden's crime rates have been as high or even higher in the past. This is where we need to apply some common sense. Countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria are not well known for their lack of crime or lack of violence, whereas Sweden once was. People make countries what they are, and bringing in hundreds of thousands of people from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria will have only two possible outcomes. Either it will make the immigrants more like the Swedes, or make Sweden more like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. All the evidence we have suggests that it is Sweden that is doing most of the changing. In other videos in this series, I've looked at birth rates, religiosity, education, and employment among migrants to Sweden, and we've seen that these humanitarian migrants and their children are behaving differently and typically more problematically than native Swedes. The trend lines for crime in Sweden are moving up. It's not a problem where the crime is now, today, as I make this video. But if things don't change and the trend lines keep moving the direction that they are, they will become a problem soon. I'll set a reminder for myself for 1 year from now to revisit the next BRA crime survey. I hope I'll be surprised, but I expect crime will continue to rise, and I expect the rise will accelerate. For the moment, I've exhausted the topic of Sweden. In the near term, I expect to turn my attention to topics like immigration in the UK and discussing wealth inequality. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by clicking the like button. If you want to see more content in a similar style, go ahead and click subscribe. Thanks for your time.